Thanks everyone for joining another Protocol Symposium. This week we have Francesco from Ethereum Foundation to talk about plans for upgrading data availability on Ethereum even further with PeerDAS in Pectra and beyond. The floor is yours, Francesco. Do you like me to share the slides or?
No, I can share them. So.
Perfect.
Okay. You see everything, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So the goal of the talk is, I would say, mostly to for it to be an update on what's going on with PeerDAS, which potentially might be in Pectra, potentially not. We kind of don't know yet. But yeah, basically where it's at in terms of the current protocol, because it has evolved quite a lot in the last year. And then yeah, maybe touch on some of the possible future developments. But yeah, as usual, kind of maybe let's take a step back and start from maybe not quite the beginning, but at least like just a quick recap. So yeah, originally we have in the prehistory of rollups, just a monolithic era. There's no rollups, just Ethereum executing all transactions. And then we can kind of go into the first rollup era, you could say the call data era, where Ethereum block space and specifically call data starts being used as a way to outsource execution by rollups. And yeah, it's still kind of not an ad hoc resource. It's just whatever was available there, but that's how we got started. And there was a few problems with that we've tried to basically the latest upgrade has tried to start correcting. And the first thing is that it was priced in gas, and this is the general resource that we use everywhere. So it would basically forced L2 transactions to compete with L1 transactions, and so of course like not the whole space was used for by L2s, basically by design. And the other thing is that cold data is meant to be retained forever by full nodes, and eventually this might change, but this is like a bigger controversial, or like not so controversial, but it's just a bigger change due to full history expiry as opposed to just expiry of specific data for rollups. And so yeah, that also kind of affects how expensive cold data is. And the other thing is just nodes have to download all of the data, and eventually the whole goal is that this shouldn't be the case, that we should have some form of sharding. Oh, it's not okay. Yeah, then I'm kind of trying to address this thing. The latest upgrade, yeah, before 844, where we create this separate resource that, as you can see here, I mean blobs, and they kind of go as a sidecar to the normal Ethereum blocks. We stop using cold data. We just have these commitments in transactions that kind of link to this basically blobs of data existing outside blocks. And it solves at least like some of the issues that we mentioned, like the in particular the first two problems. And it also kind of starts laying the cryptographic groundwork for what's to come, but doesn't yet solve what you might think is the biggest issue, which is like nodes still have to download all of the data. In particular, if you kind of zoom a bit on what's actually happening on the network layer, we have the usual block, and we have these blobs as a sidecar outside of it. And they move separately on the network layer. Like the block is sent on a specific beacon block global topic where everyone subscribes. And that's kind of always been the case throughout the beacon chain history. But then we have these blob subnets that are kind of these we're gonna call this sub networks. They're not actually sub networks because they're also global topics in this case. Like everyone still subscribes to them, participates in them, but let's say they're separate gossip topics specifically for the blobs to be separately sent. But again, everyone participates in them, so everyone downloads everything still at this point. So we haven't done any sharding, and we haven't kind of solved the biggest part of the problem. And how do we do that? Well, we introduce eventually some form of data availability sampling. Now, kind of also, yeah, I'm sure most people are familiar with the general concept, but again, recapping a bit, the general idea is we basically take this chunk of data. Of course, it's not just the chunk of data, it's in a particular form. It's field elements, but that we don't really need the math here. So we take this chunk of data, we extend it in some way, we do this erasure coding kind of magic, and with polynomials. And this basically introduces redundancy and allows us to reconstruct the data whenever we have at least 50% of it. And now this means that if we want to check availability of a blob, you only have to check that 50% of the blob is available as opposed to the whole blob. And yeah, that's basically the picture that has existed since, I guess whenever data availability sampling came up as a concept. So yeah, we ultimately basically just want nodes. And here, yeah, we can think of full nodes, we can think of light clients, we can think of validators. This is really unspecified who exactly we're talking about, but let's say generally we would like some nodes at least to be able to only download a few chunks of a blob or whatever of the whole data that we care about, as opposed to the whole to the full data. And yeah, so this is, if you're here specifically looking at a single blob extended by 2x in this way. And now we can think of basically, let's take something like today where we have like multiple blobs, maybe this sidecar kind of picture, and then we extend the whole thing. I mean, and this really means we're still extending each blob individually. It's basically just taking the blobs, individually extending them, and then putting them on top of each other, like literally almost just pictorially. They don't actually interact in any way. But we can think of doing sampling and still this kind of one-dimensional sampling on the whole matrix. And it's basically the same as just doing sampling on each blob. So this picture is actually, basically the same as this picture. And in fact, like you can think of basically, you could be doing sampling on each blob separately, and then, these red blobs will appear in different spots in every blob. Or you could be doing sampling where the indices that you sample are all the same. So you just decide which indices you want once instead of per blob. And then you require the same samples for each blob. And so you end up requiring columns. And yeah, for the purposes of what you care about, guaranteeing availability of each blob, it doesn't actually matter that you do it separately. So it's completely fine to just do this sampling where it's basically sampling on the matrix, like columns of the matrix, as opposed to individual each blob. And this like simplifies things quite a bit. And then yeah, I mean, this is okay, sure, you could do this, but then yeah, there's a lot of questions of like, how do you actually, what do you do with this? How do you actually do it on the networking layer? How you actually incorporate in the protocol? And there's kind of three things that once we have this like let's say abstract primitive of data availability sampling, we basically just have like the idea that we can do such a thing. How do we actually put it in protocol? We can maybe break it down into three phases or three components. Also, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm happy to have questions at the end, but also just like it works perfectly fine if you have any questions to just interrupt. So yeah, really feel free to do so. Or like, yeah, if there's some part that people for whatever reason like want me to slow down on or whatever, yeah, just say it. So yeah, basically the first of these three components of basically putting DAS into in the whole system essentially is distribution. And so this means how does, we have a proposer or a builder, it wants to propose a block with some blobs associated to it, some matrix of blobs. How does it actually get this data into the network? Like eventually people want to sample so that they can check that the data is available. But to be able to sample, the data somehow has to first like spread into the network. Like, unless you're literally sampling from the proposer or from the builder directly, which is a possibility. That's one way of doing it, of kind of coupling distribution sampling. Otherwise, the way that usually people think about how this should work is that just like you usually propose a block, you spread it through the network, like you initially send it, gossip it, and then other people keep spreading it. Also, this data somehow should get spread through the network, and then people have it and they can respond to sampling requests from that somehow get to them. And again, that will be specified in exactly how sampling works. And yeah, so this is kind of quite important because even the way the distribution works need to actually respect the goals that we have. Like if we were to say, oh, distribution is just that everyone sends the data everywhere, like then okay, sampling doesn't do anything. You actually need distribution to also be in some way sharded. Otherwise you're not gaining anything. And yeah, then more properly, there's the actual like sampling phase, like how do so we decided we want to maybe have samples be in columns. We want people to be doing 16 samples or whatever number it is. How do full nodes, how do validators actually get the samples that they need? Which differences are there between types of nodes and like these kinds of things. And then also just once you have sampled, what do you do with that? Like how do you actually incorporate the result of sampling? Like you get a yes or no. How do you take that into account in how you go about the protocol, basically? And this seems like an obvious thing. Oh, like, if something is not available, you just, well, it's not available, you don't care. But it's not actually, I mean, we're not going to go too in detail around it, but there's actually some subtleties to it, and it does end up affecting the kind of protocols that we want to use. And then there's the reconstruction phase. So okay, you have distribution, you have sampling. Sometimes people will disagree on whether something is available just because the data might not be actually available fully. Like it might be like 60% available. So technically it's available, it's reconstructible. But some people will see it as available and some people will not. And it could even be like 99% available. So that actually a lot of people might see it as available, even though, and I mean, they should, because it is available, it's reconstructible, but it's not fully available. And yeah, so then somehow this healing process has to happen where if the data is in fact between 50% and 100%, eventually it has to actually become 100% available. So on the top we have this like kind of sick network where all these columns are missing, but the data is actually available. It's more than 50% available, and somehow it has to get to like a healthy network where everyone is on the same page. Because I mean, we're at the end of the day building a consensus protocol, so we kind of really do need people to at the end of the day have the same view of what's happening. And yeah, these like distribution sample reconstruction are like really the three kind of key things that we need to always pretty much somehow specify and like keep in mind when we're considering the whole system. And yeah, now let's kind of get into the actual thing that we are right now building, like thinking of having in Pectra, whether or not that's going to work out. I'm calling here PeerDAS v0, or aka subnet DAS. Basically, the thing is, originally, from the very beginning, the idea was there's multiple ways that we can go about this. There are some features that we might or might not want to, at the end of the day, implement in the first version. And generally, a lot of the idea behind PeerDAS was to basically try to get to a more iterative way of going about scaling, where we're not trying to, go from like 0 or like 4844, I mean, not 0, but, whatever 4844 is, to 32 megabytes per slot or something like that. But to try to do things, yeah, more iteratively and allowing for like gradual steps. And yeah, it turns out that one of the steps might actually be to not have the sort of the feature that gives PeerDAS its name, peer sampling, and to instead do things a bit differently for the time being. And so yeah, that's why I kind of called in this other way. And yeah, so going back to this picture of like distribution sampling and reconstruction, we basically can just specify the protocol by at least at a high level, just by saying how these things are happening. So what's peculiar here is that distribution and sampling are actually one and the same. So there's basically data is distributed through, so if you remember before, there were these blob subnets that each blob would be sent through when someone was making a proposal, and these were kind of horizontal subnets in the sense that there would be a subnet for this blob and this blob and this blob, and now we're basically replacing them with these vertical subnets in some sense, if you think about this matrix. So one subnet for each column, or for collections of column, but for the purpose of this talk, we'll just say columns. And yeah, basically distribution is just one subnet for, let's say, for each column, and the proposer pushes all of the columns to all the subnets. And I mean, yeah, I guess key thing that I probably should have written, it's kind of, you can maybe see it from the picture, is not nodes. These are not global topics anymore. These are not basically networks where everyone participates, but you only participate in a certain subset of the whole network. So in this case, this node maybe is participating in this one, but not this one. So this is like the first kind of form of sharding. And the other thing is that this, the data being sent through these column subnets is also sampling. Like this node participating in a certain choice of column subnets is how this node, in this particular protocol is actually doing sampling. So distribution sampling are really the same. They happen to coincide in this protocol. And yeah, the way reconstruction works at this point is basically through a 1 of n honesty assumption. So where like basically n is like the amount of nodes that are downloading the whole data in the whole Ethereum network, which like we're gonna call super nodes. It's a bit of a weird word because there's nothing really like super about them, in the sense that especially if you're thinking about PeerDAS, this like V0 or like whatever, basically like any sort of near-term foreseeable future, like we're, again, as I said, we're not going to directly go to like 32 megabytes per slot or something like that. So it's really like something that is quite doable, even like with a lot of home connections. Like this will still be, I think, quite doable. So yeah, but it's just to have a name. Let's say that these are super nodes. They basically just instead of participating only in this one, they just participate in all of the subnets, and so just get all the data. But yeah, and as far as reconstruction, this is important because if you want to reconstruct the whole matrix, like, these columns are missing, and you've only have like a small subsets of the columns, like maybe, you are in this subnet and this subnet and like, 3 more or something, you just don't have enough data to do reconstruction, basically at this point. And so you kind of need someone that has enough of the columns, like more than 50% of the columns to be able to do it. Yeah, so in this case, basically the way the reconstruction work is that at least one of these entities that are trying to download all of the data should be honest and like be willing to actually do this reconstruction. So they would basically get all the columns that are available from the this kind of SIG network, locally just do this reconstruction. So they first would locally this going from top to bottom would first happen locally in this super nodes or whatever, like yeah, like locally here. And then they would reseed all the missing columns in their network. So if this subnet is missing its column, it's like red. Once reconstruction has happened, this guy will basically treat that column as if it had received it over the network and just propagate it to its peers. Like basically it would act as if, oh, the column just came to me, I'm gonna ascend it to my peers just like I normally would. Yeah, basically kind of propagation of all the missing things starts from there. And I mean, in a good network where hopefully this is not actually, there's not just one honest party, even if this were to happen, the data needs to be reconstructed. There should actually be like many sources where this data gets basically like gets healed and repropagated. And so hopefully this can happen actually like in a quite efficient way. And like in principle, it can actually it's possible that it could even make generally propagation better, because anyone that gets more than 50% of the columns can basically already redo the locally, do the extension, get the remaining ones, and start propagating the remaining ones. So if it happens to be the case that, there's maybe like a slow 5% of the columns, like there's some kind of distribution of like how columns are moving over subnets, and it happens to be the case that there's a 5% that are just going like somewhat slower than the others, or, there's some long tail of slow subnets at some point for whatever reason. And yeah, those ones maybe end up actually getting repropagated after having been reconstructed, as opposed to just like going through the direct propagation only. So yeah, that's kind of how, at again, a very high level, but how what the protocol looks like. Now let's take a second to think what this looks like compared to 4844. So one thing, of course, is that we now have this extension, like this orange stuff is the erasure coding. So the size of the data is increased by 2x, but we now have this like nice kind of redundancy that allows us to do reconstruction. And then, today we have 6 blobs max. So we have 6 blob subnets because it's just one subnet per blob. And blobs are these like chunky objects. They're like 128 kilobytes. And then, I mean, if we were to take the extended ones, it would be 256. But yeah, here again, we don't have blob subnets. We have these vertical column subnets. And these column subnets, they're actually quite a lot thinner. Now, I don't remember off the top of my head how thin they are compared to blobs, but like, yeah, quite a lot thinner. Quite a lot lighter if, of course, we don't increase the blob count so much that eventually, like, I mean, the columns will be heavier as we increase the blob count. But yeah, basically we've replaced these like few chunky subnets with like a good amount, specifically in the current spec 128 like thin kind of light subnets or like subnets where like light objects go through essentially. And yeah, nodes only participate in a subset of the subnets. So we finally have sharding. And how many subnets do nodes participate in? This is basically something that is a security consideration. Like the answer is basically as many as it's or like as few as it's okay for our security needs. So if we think that 8 is enough for security, then 8. If you think that, okay, no, it has to be 16, then 16. And I'll kind of go over what does it actually mean, like what are security needs and how this contributes to them. But yeah, actually in the spec, it is today 8, basically. So you can, actually, I think I'll just go over it later. Yeah, and basically, more precisely, there's a bit of a distinction. There's like two sort of types of things that a node is doing in this distribution / sampling process. One we call custody, and it's basically the node selects in the current spec again 4 columns in a deterministic but pseudo-random way. In this case, it's basically sort of using their node ID as a seed. So it's like manipulable randomness, but if you're like an honest node, then whatever, you just have a random node ID. So it's basically random. And yeah, you're basically required to participate in these subnets. So essentially, everyone can see what your node ID is, and based on your node ID, they can tell that what the subnets are that you're required to participate in. So for every one of your peers, you can sort of hold them accountable. Like they have to be in the subnets that their node ID says that they should be in, and if not, you can downscore them, disconnect from them, and so on. And this is something that we also do in a similar way for attestation subnets. The goal of this is basically to ensure that there's a stable backbone for the subnet, so that basically there's enough people. Like in this case, it would be 4 out of 128. So every node would be in 1/32 of all subnets. And this is basically to make sure that the subnets are not too sparse. Again, it's the same thing that we do for attestation subnets. That's basically like the only reason that the number is what it is. But there's also some extra, like what we might call like extra subnet sampling. These two things like don't actually look any different in practice. Like they are the same thing. You just join some subnets and you get those columns. Except, I mean, it depends. We might decide to make the way you do the selection of these extra subnets slightly different, or maybe not. At the moment, they actually literally are the same thing, and there's only a sort of technical reason for like future compatibility why they're kind of separated. Why, like, it's basically just that we only want to enforce 4 subnets because in the future we might actually replace this extra sampling with something else, and we don't want to make it hard to do the networking upgrade. Like we don't want people to say, oh, you need to be subscribed to 8 at the moment that we upgrade. But yeah, it's just kind of more of a technicality. But basically, other than that, the idea is just that there is like a base of subnets that you want to be subscribed to for just this like the network stability kind of reasons. But then the total amount of subnets that you want to be subscribed to, and this is basically the total amount of samples that you're getting, because every subnet you're in is one column that you get. Again, because distribution sampling are the same, just the samples just get to you through basically the normal gossip process. Yeah, the total amount of subnets is basically your sampling count, like how many samples you're getting. And so this is what determines, in some sense, like how much security you're getting. This is what I was about to say before, that because we're doing the parameter happens to be 8, like 4 plus 4, we have 8 columns out of 128. So 1/16 of the extended data is what every full node is meant to download, which is 1/8 of the original data. And so in some sense, this you can think of as like a scaling factor. It's like what tells you compared to 4844, basically how much less bandwidth is the CL at least the CL network supposed to utilize for propagation. Of course, it's not completely apple to apples. We're kind of changing the way the subnets work. We don't have these like chunky subnets. We have these like lighter subnets, but roughly this is what we should find basically. And I think at least from there's been some DevNets, and I think similar like this kind of thing has been roughly seen in practice. Yeah, for validators, this story is similar, but not entirely the same. So we basically have this concept called validator custody. And here the idea is not so much about this backbone for the subnets. It's more about basically ensuring a floor for the, well, there's two ideas. I guess let's say first of all, like what exactly is validator custody is just saying you have to custody at least 8 columns. And of course, this 8 could be 16, it could be some other number. Just there's some minimum of columns that you should custody if you have validators. Like here again, it's at the node level, not validator level. Like we're thinking about a node in a network, but the node might have validators attached. If it does, it should have at least some minimum, in this case 8, of columns and associated subnets that it needs to basically participate in. Or 1 per validator, whichever is higher. So if you have 9 validators, then you'll be doing 9 and so on. And there's basically 2 reasons. Like the minimum part is to have basically a security floor, basically saying that, okay, if you're a node that has a validator, you're participating in consensus, you're testing, your attestations have to have a sort of minimum security level. And again, this is sort of not clear at the moment what it actually means, but hopefully it will become clear later. And then the other thing is the scaling part of like 1 column per validator. And so let's say custody scaling. And the idea is just basically, the more validators you have, the more ETH you have, the more you could say you should contribute to the network. And if you have at least with these parameters, 128 validators, which is 4,000 ETH, so a few millions worth of stake, you basically, at least by default, if you don't change your client, you'll be a supernode participating in all subnets. Again, like supernode is very much like a quotation mark. It doesn't mean that you need some kind of crazy requirements to run it, but also like we're talking about nodes that have millions of stake. And such a node, like one helpful thing is, as we said before, like they would do reconstruction. So they kind of help this like quite critical actually part of the whole protocol. The other really nice thing is that a node that is downloading everything or almost everything is basically not affected by sampling in the sense that it doesn't matter to it kind of in its consensus participation, it only has like a it's irrelevant to this node that sampling is going on elsewhere. Like in its own consensus participation, because it downloads everything, there's no way to trick it. There's no way to get it to make like even temporarily a wrong decision. So maybe to like give you an idea what this means, like imagine, I think about Celestia. They have at least like as of the latest that I know, basically 2 separate networks. There's a network where essentially only nodes that download the whole data live, and in particular validators need to be downloading the whole data. And so this network is not at all affected by sampling. Sampling is kind of something that lives on like a different layer, and it's something that like clients do for their own purposes. But as far as like the validators are concerned, they're not affected by it. It's like, okay, if there's something wrong with sampling, maybe like clients will not be convinced that that everything is fine. They might like go protest on Twitter, and I mean that's helpful. Like if actually there was something malicious going on, you want that. But as far as like the consensus layer itself, it's basically functions as if sampling was not there. Which actually like it's something kind of helpful. It gives it more resiliency. In our case, it's not like that. It's not that every validator will be a super node. It's not that every validator will be completely unaffected by sampling. But at the end of the day, if you look at what the actual stake distribution looks like, maybe 80%, 90% of validators would actually fall into under this category, I think, or like yeah, of 80, 90% of the stake. And so most of the network, most of the voting weight would actually kind of have this benefit of like not really being affected by the introduction of sampling. And so I think it's something that can give us like a lot more confidence in actually deploying something like this. That it's not gonna like make consensus blow up, or it's like much less likely to do so. And then yeah, a little aside on like the question that I touched on before, like, okay, you do sampling, you're a full node, you're a validator, what do you actually do with that? And yeah, as I said, there's some technical subtleties. I probably shouldn't go into it, but yeah, basically you can think that you either ignore so like if you have a yeah, I should have said what. Yeah, they ignore them being a block that is unavailable. So let's say that there's a block that for which sampling fails. You would either just ignore it, like you don't even we say import it in your for choice tree. Like you basically, it's almost like you don't even consider that it exists really. Or just as far as the for choice is concerned, you kind of ignore it as you're running the for choice. Like you sort of skip over it and don't go down the branch. Like if you're comparing two blocks. And then one of the two is unavailable, you just discard the one that's unavailable once you're running the for choice. There's like technical difference in like why these two things are not the same, but the kind of important message is that either way, you'd never see an unavailable block as canonical. Like you never your view of the canonical chain will never include unavailable blocks, and this is quite important both for full nodes because as a full node, what you want to do, you want to confirm transactions, and you also just want to act as like a last kind of guardian for the network. And so you want to basically make sure that in either case that you never think that unavailable things are canonical. And for validators, like you don't want to vote for things that are unavailable. Now we'll kind of delve a bit into like some of the actual more concrete security properties and like how we get them. And so yeah, there's kind of two levels that we care about. Let's start with the node level properties. And this is basically the full node kind of transaction confirmation security properties. So I'm a full node in this case in my capacity as like I'm maybe just don't want to listen to Infura. I want to like I don't know confirm transactions by myself. And there's kind of two. I mean, and I want that to be live and safe. I hopefully if I send a transaction and it is confirmed, I would like to know it. And I don't want double spends. And this has kind of this can be for non-finalized transactions. Like if you're maybe whatever the buying and coffee use case or whatever it is, you don't care to wait for finality. And for finalized transactions for like more important things. And then there is the system level properties or like global properties. And this is basically more of a, let's say you have like a God's view of the Ethereum blockchain, what is going on there, like what properties hold at this level where you're not considering the view of a specific node, but just like the blockchain as a whole. And one of the two things that we care about is literally just, does consensus work? Consensus security, is it live and safe? And in particular, if we have at least some percentage of the validators being non-super nodes. So we're not in the Celestia case, we're in the Ethereum case. A lot or a little, but at least some of the validators will not download all of the data. And the other thing is basically rollup safety, which is, okay, ultimately this data is being used by rollups. It's very important to them that the data is available because it really directly impacts their security properties. And in particular, what's really important to rollups, because Ethereum kind of, it's very helpful that they post on Ethereum because if they're a rollup on Ethereum, because it doesn't matter what the validator set says if ultimately the majority of full nodes just ignore this chain. Like if the validators can sign some finalized block that's unavailable, rollups don't necessarily have to have their security properties break because of that. If there is like if there are enough full nodes that are doing sampling and that kind of act as a barrier, as a last defense against this kind of malicious majority attacks by the validator set. And in particular, basically what we want is that the canonical chain of most and really like the vast majority of full nodes is available. So if there is some unavailable finalizations, most full nodes, like think like 90% of full nodes will not see it as available, will not finalize it, and they'll know that something is going on and they'll go complain in the real world. Now, usually the kind of property that people both intuitively and also like formally think about when thinking about sampling and what it gives you is what we might call this individual sampling property. So basically, what it says is that you take n sufficiently large, n is the number of sampling agents. Each one makes k queries, and the queries that are random, but very importantly, it's not possible to link the queries to to the agent making them. So if I make k queries in some way to the network or whatever, it's not easy or it's impossible to tell that these queries are all coming from me. So the queries look like they're just like from the network. And here it's important, of course, that there's a lot of people there or a lot of agents that are making queries. And then, yeah, we can say that basically if all the queries succeed, the data is available except with probability 2 to the minus k. And this is the sort of, trivial kind of thing of, the basic idea of like, you do erasure coding and now you only have to check 50% availability instead of 100 and then you get this. But it's actually quite strong, this assumption of query and linkability. Like, you're some agent on the network. What does it mean in practice? You're a node and you're making queries. How do you actually ensure that it's hard to link the queries to you? Like how can you tell that if you ask for column 5 and column 10 in some way to your peers or through a DHT or you subscribe to the subnets, how do you actually make sure that people don't know that there is someone that wants column 5 and column 10, or even that it's physically you that want column 5 and column 10? And yeah, so this is quite a strong property to really like if all security depended on this, I think it would be quite sketchy. But like thankfully that's not the case. We have a property that's weaker but with much better assumptions. And so again, we take n sufficiently large for some, and there's n sampling agents. K queries uniformly random out of m total samples. Like here, it's actually important how many samples there are, but it's not important that the queries are unlinkable. So here, really, you can think of like someone that knows everything about what's being asked, like someone that observes all of the queries, knows exactly who's asking what exactly. And still, there's something that we can say. We basically say that with high probability, if the data is not available, and most a small fraction delta of nmk of the agents has all their queries satisfied. This is a bit vague because I'm not saying anything about, okay, but what's up with delta? Is it actually, does it go to 0 in some way? But it's a bit hard to actually like, phrase exactly, phrasing it in a way that makes sense in this context. But I mean, you'll see kind of more concretely like what this delta is. But yeah, basically think of it as like a small fraction, like a few percentage points or something like that. It's not a vanishing fraction. It's not exponentially decaying in k or something like that, but it's a small fraction and it's kind of practically something that we can work with. And so yeah, basically with enough sampling, but still like a small constant amount, like I think k equals 8, k equals 16, like still these kind of numbers, a small minority can be tricked. So it's not negligible. It's not, it's not 99.99, whatever is going to be secure. It might be that a few percent can be tricked. But this is in the face of the adversary knowing everything, like really having perfect information over what's being asked. It's like a purely combinatorial property, which is really nice because it's just, we don't have to worry about, even the most powerful adversary can't really do anything about this. And yeah, the way this works is kind of, or like the way we can get a bound for what this delta is basically think of the probability of tricking a fraction epsilon of the n sampling agents. So there's n agents. By the way, do you see my cursor?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And we have n epsilon agents. So this is like, maybe epsilon is like 5%, and this is like 5% of n that the adversary is trying to trick. And we have, again, m columns or total samples, and everyone is doing k samples. So basically what the adversary, like we can basically all the possibility that the adversary has are this, like they can choose an epsilon subset of agents to trick. So it is n epsilon. So n choose n epsilon is like choose some subset of people to trick. That's large enough. And then you choose m over 2 out of m samples to make available. So you choose basically which half of the data to make available. You don't make available, columns 1 through 63 or 64 or something. You make available a specific weird half of the data, like 1, 10, 18, 23, and I don't know, whatever. And whatever, this half of the data is chosen in a way that works out for you based on what the queries were. And then for this choice, the probability of success is the same as before, like the kind of nice, like exponentially decaying numbers that we had before. So 2 to the minus k times the number of agents that you're trying to trick, basically, because this is just like the number of queries that these agents make together. And I mean, as it turns out, basically, this is the asymptotic behavior of this thing. It just, yeah, you can't really get that much out of this, but yeah, you can approximate that thing and you eventually get to this. So you can see that, for example, at k equals 10, it's maybe like 4% or something. But yeah, here, this is the in percentage. So that this would be like 10% and so on. Yeah, this is actually, this blue thing is non-asymptotic. It's like an actual approximation for n equals 4,000 and m equal 128. Like both of them are an approximation, but both of them are kind of asymptotic approximations, but this one is still with the actual parameters and not trying to take n to infinity. And you can see that anyway, they're not very different. Like we have for k equals 8, asymptotically would be like 5.3%, whereas with n equals 4,000, and this would be like the number of nodes basically that are doing sampling, m equals 128, it's still pretty small essentially. So it's like this kind of numbers, like 5%, 3%, 7% based on what parameters you choose. So it's kind of fits into this like when we are okay with a small minority failing, sort of. And yeah, as far as the security properties, so we had these global properties, and this kind of global sampling property really fits them quite well. Like particularly, let's think about roll-up safety, full node custody. So this, we had this thing that full nodes. I mean, actually, I should write full node sampling here, not just custody. The fact that full nodes do these like 8 total samples, like custody plus the extra sampling. This basically is what ensures roll-up safety. Like it really, almost follows just by the definition of roll-up safety. If the chain is unavailable and we have this global sampling safety, so let's pick the parameters we had, like k equals 8, then most like 6% of the full nodes or 5% of the full nodes will be tricked because they do 8 samples. And so like the vast majority of them will go on Twitter and say what's going on. Yeah, for consensus security, it's quite a similar thing, but in this case, through validator custody. So the fact that, yeah, we really enforce that a node with validators has to do enough sampling, and we even like scale the custody with the number of validators. This basically gives us, I mean, this is not obvious, and actually it also involves the fact that the assumption that we have fast reconstruction of things that are in an in-between state of availability. But yeah, you basically, through these two things, you can kind of get that the consensus protocol should work as if it would without sampling, roughly speaking. Again, there's a lot of nuance to all these things, but yeah, roughly, these are the ideas. So yeah, basically validator custody, what it does is like, again, same ideas before. We want to apply the global sampling property. So if only a small minority of honest valid, so yeah, we can get through the global sampling property that in most a small minority of honest validators votes for unavailable blocks. So quickly unavailable blocks will be reorged because it's only going to look that they have very little weight. Even if we have we have a sizable adversary, like let's say that taking the parameters from before, let's say that the adversary controls 40% of the network, still an unavailable block will never be able to reach a majority because only like a small percentage of the honest validators will vote for it. And yeah, so basically this kind of error that comes from being able to trick a small minority of honest validators only makes our honest majority assumption a bit stronger. Like we need to, instead of assume 50%, we then maybe need to assume like 53% or something like that, of the validators being honest. So it's just strengthened. It requires us to strengthen our assumptions of honest majority a bit, but not too much. And yeah, the kind of nice thing is everyone agrees on unavailability. So if something is unavailable, quickly everyone sees it as unavailable because it's not voted on by a majority. And if instead we have the other case where a block is it's not unavailable, but it's also not fully available, it's in the in-between state of like 50%, greater than 50, but not 100%, then because we assume fast reconstruction, like specifically we assume that this happens in a kind of faster than slot time, basically, then quickly is going to be reconstructed and everyone sees it as available. And so everyone agrees on availability. And of course, ensuring that everyone agrees on the availability state of things is quite important because it's, again, we're talking about consensus. So that's the whole point, that people should be agreeing on things. And so, yeah, basically the idea is availability does not introduce in either way, either with availability or unavailability, it does not introduce difference of views between people, or at least they're quickly corrected. And yeah, then there is these individual properties, the transaction confirmation properties, and let's kind of zoom in on those. So again, the same property, and like specifically through validator custody, actually quickly gives us that things are fine for non-finalized transactions. So the idea here is just that before finality, we are anyway trusting honest majority. Like if something is not finalized and there is not an honest majority, they can reorg it regardless, and they will not suffer an economic penalty or anything like that. And so basically, yeah, pre-finality, we for our for any hope of getting something good, we have to assume that there is an honest majority in the validator set. If we do have an honest majority, or like honest plus a little bit, then we will get that everything is fine, that basically the canonical chain will work, will be live, safe, and it's going to be available by basically, again, this, the fact that consensus works, which again is a consequence of validator custody, and by the fact that validator custody gives us that unavailable things will not be able to be canonical, basically. Now the trouble, I'm actually, okay, we're not at the trouble yet, but yeah, so liveness when it comes to finalized transactions is yeah, again, fine, just comes from validator custody. Like if we have a honest supermajority validators, they're able to finalize things. I mean, consensus is going to be live, same thing as before. But safety, so we can split safety even more. So safety in this case, we're not thinking about is there a double finality or something, because that has nothing to do with availability. Like let's just assume that there is not going to be double finality, or anyway that if there is double finality, we accept the fact that there is an economic cost associated to that, and that's what safety means. But yeah, the thing that we want to protect against is like, okay, there is a single finalized block, but then it turns out that it's unavailable. And maybe eventually it's reorged because the canonical chain cannot be unavailable. Full nodes complain and so on. And eventually this leads to a fork, to a social fork, and to a double spend. Now for super nodes, this is just not a problem, because if you're a super node, you download all of the data. If it's unavailable, then it's unavailable. There's no way to trick you, so there's no problem. So it's basically impossible to use availability to trick a super node, which is quite obvious in some sense. And then yeah, for full nodes, it's actually a lot of it's a lot trickier. The issue is this query linkability thing that we've kind of talked about before. Like if we did have this individual sampling property of this 2 to the minus k, and we did have really like the assumption was satisfied of query linkability, then we would have that or unlinkability, then the property would be we would have this property. Then it would also be fine for full nodes. Like you see a finalized block, you do your sampling, no one can tell that your queries are yours. Like they cannot tell who's asking what, and so it's hard to kind of put you aside and trick you individually. And yeah, it's not that you can trick like 5% of the network. You can't really trick anyone individually, except if you're incredibly lucky, like with negligible probability. And so yeah, this problem is quite hard to solve. Like you require some kind of anonymous routing of queries, essentially. And it's really not within the scope of anything that of like it's definitely not something that it's going to be in an Ethereum upgrade anytime soon, both because yeah, I mean, yeah, this is something that really requires a lot of research. And but the good thing, so this is the bad thing. The good thing is that this is really hard to attack. So we're talking about again, the whole premise was like finalized block that is unavailable. So first of all, it needs a malicious supermajority. Not even 1/3. It really needs like a supermajority because again, with validator custody, validators, except for a small minority, do not vote for things that are unavailable. So if you want to finalize an unavailable thing, you need basically 2/3 of the validator set to be doing it, and really be willing to go as far as causing a social fork, like to the point where not only is the finalized thing is unavailable for some time, but actually for enough time that people just fork off and like coordinate fork off. And yeah, it's also just hard to profit because of this thing. Or like two things. One is this, like you cannot trick supernodes. So, an exchange hopefully would run a supernode, would just download all the data. So you can't really double spend an exchange. Or, I mean, anyone that has like any money on the line, you would hope that they would just basically protect themselves and just download all the data. Significant amount of money on the line, of course. I think already this part is quite a good protection. Like this is really like a catastrophic attack. It's kind of like, yeah, basically like a worst case scenario. Most of the validator set is malicious, so for most purposes, this is already something that like yeah, you really would not worry about too much when you're transacting. But yeah, most people that really have like very, very high amounts of money on the line, that hopefully they would go down this path. And so the only people you can actually double spend are this small fraction of regular full nodes that you happen to be able to or that you manage to target. But again, a small fraction, even of those, only a small fraction, because of the sampling that they do. And yeah, so overall, kind of, I mean, this is the picture. This is the only thing that we cannot quite satisfy through sampling, but again, still with some mitigating factors into like the severity of the problem. And actually, like it turns out that there is something that we can do to at least improve the situation there. So this is what's called accountable validator custody. So this is where basically you change validator custody to be so that so the way that it is today in the spec is that validators are basically free to choose what they want to custody. They have like an obligation, or rather like a default behavior of custodying a certain amount of things that are prescribed by the protocol, but then they can choose what these things are essentially. And this would not be the case with accountable validator custody. Like basically the protocol would sort of choose for you and would assign you something. And then if something like the catastrophe scenario happens, like finalized data is not available, there's a social fork. We're really in this awful kind of worst case scenario. Once the social fork happens, validators that didn't satisfy the assignment they had, I mean, if the social fork happened to begin with, the data was not available, it means that basically a supermajority or a near supermajority of validators did not satisfy the assignment that they had, at least not publicly, like they didn't release the data they were supposed to release. That data just isn't available. And so you can basically slash these validators as part of the process of the social fork. And then like, yeah, maybe a bit more precisely, one way to do it that also takes into account some privacy considerations is that, or like, basically anonymity for validators, is that you can have the assignment not really be like publicly in protocol, but it can be chosen based on a validator's BLS signature. So this is actually how we do selection of aggregators today for attestations. This is basically something like you sign with your BLS key something like it can be an epoch number, it can be like a special message, basically just anything, but like a signature that you don't reveal to anyone. And of course, no one can replicate it because it's your BLS signature. So they can't forge messages, forge signatures. And yeah, basically, normally in everything is working fine, you don't reveal it. And I mean, based on this BLS signature, you kind of use it as a seed, or like you hash it and you use it as a seed, and you choose what things you're supposed to custody. And because it's private, it doesn't help people to match validators with nodes. Like you see that nodes are doing something, they're sampling some things, they're participating in some subnets, but because what validators are supposed to custody is private, you can't use this information to help you figure out which nodes are being, which validators are being run by which nodes, basically. which I mean, this is possible to do in other ways, like, but at least it doesn't make it easier. But it's verifiable if needed. Like if we are in the case of this catastrophe scenario, there's a fork, et cetera, et cetera. You can just reveal the signature, and everyone can verify that, oh, indeed that's your signature on the agreed upon message and so on. And then they can compute the assignment that it implies. Like they can just redo the pseudo random thing, and they can basically tell, okay, is the data that the columns that you were supposed to custody, have we agreed that these were available? Like as part of of this fork, you maybe just agree on which columns are kind of which columns are known to be available, like which are the good ones, and like that people shouldn't be slashed for essentially. And if everything checks out, like you're not your assignment is satisfied essentially, then you can withdraw, and otherwise you cannot essentially, or some variation of this. And with this, you can kind of say that, okay, actually you can improve this catastrophe scenario kind of situation without necessarily having query unlinkability, just because essentially you can in some way put an economic cost on such an attack, like similarly to just like how we put an economic cost on double finality. So this attack actually becomes like similar to double finality in that sense. Like you can say, okay, if this happens, then a supermajority of the validator set is basically is going to have a really hard time withdrawing. Like if not, they will not be able to withdraw unless they actually make the data available before everything like things are too deep in motion. And I mean, if they did make the data available, everything is fine. There's no actual double spend. There's no fork. If they don't make the data available, the fork happens, then they actually get slashed, or anyway, they cannot withdraw. So it kind of puts this into a more similar bucket to double finality in terms of consequences. And yeah, now kind of as a last bit on the current protocol, or like what's happening with the current spec and so on, or the current hard fork and et cetera, et cetera. Just a quick idea of like how much can we expect to get out of this, like subnet DAS construction in terms of scaling. And yeah, basically with the parameters that we mentioned, as I already said, like there's this 8x scaling factors. This basically only applies to nodes that are either full nodes, like that have 0 validators, or up to 8 validators, because of the way validator custody works. Like if you have more than 8 validators, then you're gonna have more columns, and so the scaling factor will get worse for you. But basically for anyone that is like in this kind of bottom part of the resource distribution, which mostly is where people should fall if their full nodes are running like just a few validators, then you get this full kind of 8x scaling factor, let's say. But this is really, again, only for CL consensus layer bandwidth. And so, yeah, what would this mean in practice if we could actually take advantage fully of this room that this appears to give us? Is that we could go from 3 target and 6 max blobs to 24 48, which is around 6 megabytes. And this is kind of roughly 5x away, 6 megabytes max. And yeah, this is roughly like 5x away from the original goal, which was like 16 megabytes and target and 32 max. So like really not, I mean, incredibly far away, at least like even with this somewhat, simple kind of upgrade on 4844, like at least simple in the sense that we're really not doing anything crazy from a networking perspective. There's no like new networking techniques being used really. We can actually get within like a striking distance of something that was like a kind of long-term goal in some sense. How to improve from there is, well, one thing is we could increase the subnet count. So this 128, could become 256 or something like that. This just makes for thinner samples, and so less bandwidth. But it doesn't necessarily increase much, like doing k equals 8, m equals 128 is not much better than k equals 8 and m equal 256 in terms of security. Like if you increase k maybe by a little bit, like from 8 to 10 or something like that, it would almost definitely, I mean, I can check the numbers, but I'm pretty sure it would more than compensate for the, like increasing the subnets, the number of subnets. So m makes security a bit worse for the same k, but the impact of K is much greater. So as soon as you do a bit more samples, that like very much like compensates. So yeah, basically the idea is you can increase subnet count while still doing the same number of samples. So samples get smaller, but the number of samples doesn't increase or increases only by a little bit. So this is one option kind of. And then another option is there is a lot of work already ongoing, because networking is one of the bottlenecks for a lot of things, to try to reduce the overhead of subnets. And so like try to reduce, for example, the number of duplicates that happen to be in subnets, and just generally make it so that the bandwidth is used as efficiently as possible. So there's like things really happening at the level of gossip sub and all these kind of things. And hopefully over time, this should basically make the utilization better. And then, I mean, another thing is that we can kind of keep going on our path and move beyond subnet DAS, like change the way we do sampling and kind of, take a step forward into this, distribution sampling reconstruction kind of picture. But one thing that we should keep in mind is that we cannot get the full benefits of data sharding in the CL. So we've sharded the distribution and sampling on the CL side, but there's still this EL blob mempool that exists, and it's not necessary in some sense. Like it's possible for blobs to be sent directly to builders, and for through MEVBoost or through EPBS or through whatever it is, eventually still hit the protocol. But if we still want to in the future to let most of the blob flow happen through the public mempool, then we should also think of sharding the public mempool basically. And I mean there are reasons, for example, related to inclusion lists, for which we might actually want to have at least the ability to have the public mempool being high capacity in some sense. And I mean another reason is, I guess there's been various, at least consideration of proposals that go more in the direction of forcing things through the public mempool, like really trying to ensure that if something hasn't been in public mempool, it cannot actually end up in in the canonical chain. And I mean, in that case, we really would 100% need something like this, like a high capacity public mempool. And I mean, this is really like a sketch, but just to give you an idea, what can this look like? There's like, I mean, myriad way that you could do this, but at least a simple one that seems to at least be like, to plausibly make sense, is that you could shard by sender address. So, this, basically this guy is someone that's participating in the mempool but doesn't want to participate in the whole mempool. They choose this shard 13. Let's say that there's 16 shards for whatever. And you basically only get blobs if the first hexadecimal character in the sender address matches your shard. So in this case, it's D, and there's some peer. Maybe this peer is like a high capacity node. They're in all of the mempools, or in this case, two mempools, or two shards of the mempool. And they tell you, okay, I have sorry. They tell you, I have this blob and this blob, or this blob transaction, this blob transaction. One starts with D, the other one starts with 5. And I mean, already today the mempool works by pulling, so you will only you have to ask to get something. And so in this case, you just only modify your behavior in the mempool to pull only things that start with the right thing. And so it's actually, I mean, this part of only pulling things that match your shard is really easy, and it's just like a local change. Like you could go in any one of you, if you run a full node, you can go and do this in your code right now and just pull less blobs. But then yeah, I mean, there's other things that you need to do to really make this work on a kind of a system level, like basically making it so that you can find the right peers. And yeah, I mean, we have things like this in the CL, not as much in the EL. So there's yeah, some work to do there. And of course, we should also consider like different designs. And yeah, I mean, this is really, again, this is a sketch, and it's not something that there's been much work on. Another consideration is that's been brought up a lot is local block building, and like what exactly this should look like. And basically, I mean, the question with local block building is, if you connect to MEVBoost, sure, you're not actually dealing with the block. You're not actually dealing with the blobs. You don't have to push them to the network. You don't have to do the encoding, like you're kind of, yeah, you don't do the work essentially. So it works fine. So for, 90% of the network or whatever the figure is, it's going to work that way and it's going to be fine. As long as the builders can handle it, which they should be able to. But for this like smaller percentage of the network that wants to build blocks locally for whatever reason, be it ideological or whatever it is, anyway to contribute to the health of the network in some sense, then it's kind of the more we increase the blob count, the harder it gets to be able to do this. Probably the biggest blocker to doing this is upload bandwidth. Like you have to if we think of the picture as it is normally, like you have to publish the beacon block, okay, but then you have to publish all of these columns, and doing so in a reasonable time so that they quickly get to all your peers, and they just get propagated in the network fast enough to meet the attestation deadline. It is not easy for like a home connection, or particularly like, I mean, there's lower resourced connections in the network, or in some places in the world it's harder to get, like Australia or something. I don't know, even places where you wouldn't think, but sometimes it's hard to get like really good connections, or good enough connections. And yeah, basically the way you could do this is to essentially piggyback on other people in other nodes in the network that are resourced. And the way you would do this is you only send the beacon block at first, at least, and you make sure that the beacon block is gone and it's propagating. And then if you want, you can start to try to send the blobs, but you could also not in principle. And but the blobs in this case, they're all coming from the public, from this blob pool. And I mean, this, if you're a local block builder, of course, that's the case, because where else are you going to get them? And so, yeah, the block makes its way to this beacon block topic. So through the whole network, eventually, and I mean quite quickly, it's going to get to some super nodes. And again, this quote unquote super nodes, they're not super, but yeah, basically someone that is connected to all of the column subnets. And I mean, in particular, hopefully someone that has all of the blobs in their like all of the blobs that you put into your block, they already have in their local mempool. I mean, here there's this mempool in the sky. Of course, that doesn't exist. Everyone has their own local mempool. But yeah, these blobs have been circulated in the Yell mempool, and hopefully these nodes, or at least some of these nodes, have all of them. If they do have all of them, they can now redo do actually, in this case, you don't need to have done it. Like, here there's no orange part. You can not have done the computation in principle, but they would do this extension. So they would do the erasure coding, and now they act as the new propagation source. So, you send out your blob, and then it hits a few of these people, and they end up being the one that basically regenerate or like basically start in various points in the network the propagation of the full thing, or at least of the blob part and column part more of the whole thing. While, I mean, the block is just going by itself and it doesn't need help, let's say. And so, yeah, basically they can help you with your propagation needs essentially without, in a distributed way, like without really needing to say, okay, I need to configure something, or you just send out the block, and hopefully people are adhering to the default behavior and they will do this. But yeah, another thing to say about local block building is that also, I mean, sure, we should try to make it as possible, as viable as possible to propose blocks with a high amount of blobs, even for local block builders, and that's the goal of the previous slide and these kind of constructions. But on the other end, like, we should also recognize that it's not really, economically speaking, like a huge problem for someone not to be doing that. Like, for someone, for example, to be setting a higher maximum number of blobs that they want to propose, or like, having like a smaller public mempool and not really trying to pull as many blobs as possible when it comes to their slot for proposing. And the reason just is like, I mean, of course, this is just historical data from even like a few months, so it's hard to tell like what it means in the future. But basically, so far, we have the validator on average proposes about 2.5 blocks per year. I mean, this is not historical data. This is just a number based on the number of validators that we have, and it's only going to go down over time. But yeah, what's historical data is like, the revenue from priority fees from blob transactions per block. So yeah, like if you consider blocks that have had blob transactions, like what's the average revenue from priority fees for those blocks? It's basically always been extremely low, and at most, I mean, it's peaked in June at like $5 or like a little bit more. And so basically, once we look at yearly, we are talking about like $10, like $20, really at the highest. Of course, if we increase the blob count, you could say that, well, there's going to be more blobs, more tips. But also, there's more space. It means that there's less likelihood of congestion. So it's, yeah, I mean, of course, we can't easily extrapolate what's going to happen here, but at least so far, if you compare to the missed MEV boost rewards, like here we're talking about local block builders, so people that have explicitly chosen not to use MEV boost, and which is fine. But the amount of money that you leave on the table by not using MEV boost, it's like more than an order of magnitude more yield than the kind of money that we're talking about here, at least just based on these last few months. And yeah, that said, let's actually, what time is it? Just to make sure that I'm not completely okay.
We are a
Oh,
bit over time, like
oh,
about 10, 15 minutes over time, but no
oh, okay.
worries.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess not sure. I mean, for me, it's fine, but also I don't want to like keep people here. So maybe yeah, let's just make a check of like I don't know. Given that there's 10 people, yeah, how many people would prefer to just like, let's say, move to questions or something like that, or versus like just doing the rest? It shouldn't be too much, but also, yeah, I mean, I understand we're like already quite over time, so I don't want to take people's day. And I mean, also, yeah, if people have questions, I don't want to, I do want to get to that part. So I don't
I
know.
suggest that we take a round of questions and then decide to
Okay, yeah,
continue or
let's do
not.
that. Sure.
I can start with one question.
Mhm.
So throughout the presentation, it seems like for many of the guarantees, we rely on existence of super nodes. And
Mhm.
although I understand, like we could assume there's just one supernode and it's not a big assumption, it feels like if we just have one supernode, then things such as like fast reconstruction and fast propagation of like what has been reconstructed become quite tricky in the sense that do we need to increase the slot time to accommodate the reconstruction time, or uh, like can the malicious block proposer try to play timing games such that like the reconstruction mm, how should I put it, like don't propagate enough data until it's too late and then propagate enough data, and like basically I'm trying to say like when is the where is the deadline for like not full node decide that the block is not available. Say I make some samples, I or query some samples and they're just not there. Do I immediately consider that block like missing or unavailable, or uh, will I retry? How many times I retry? Stuff like that. Like it seems like there is a lot of complexity hidden there, and especially if we don't have many supernodes that do this reconstruction quickly, hopefully, it's kind of iffy whether things will work out. Am I
Yeah,
missing something?
so no, it's a very good question. There's a few answers. One, maybe the kind of, I don't know, less interesting one, but I actually think in practice like quite impactful, um, is that there's this validator custody thing, and one of the goals, as I said, is actually to make it so that by default there should be many supernodes. And I mean, and again, the word supernodes, I'm just using what's been used, but it is doesn't it's not super, it's not very super, so it's not like a crazy thing to think, oh, okay, there's going to be like hundreds or thousands of such nodes in the network, I think. And I think by default that is what should be the case, if validators just follow this like default behavior of custody. So that's one thing that, okay, if at the end of the day, if the if validators don't follow the protocol, then yeah, consensus would not work. If even like actually a minority of validators, at least of these ones that have a lot of nodes that have a lot of validators, really do follow this default behavior and are super nodes and are well enough resourced to handle reconstruction, then there should be many sources of reconstruction, as opposed to like, it's a one of an assumption in principle, but we actually don't really want just one such entity. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, I mean, in terms of the timing things, basically, a block gets proposed, and by 4 seconds, people vote. Now, at this point, there's already a first kind of cutoff and determination. Like if at this point, most people have seen the data as, have seen the block as not available, and they vote against it, then the block is already kind of not super relevant because it's very easily reorgable. I mean, in the specific dynamic of how our protocol works, the next proposer would be able to just reorg it with proposer boost. And so basically, if it's just at 50%, then it's not going to it's not even going to make it, let's say, to like cause problems. Like just the vast majority of people will just not vote for it, and yeah, it's not going to cause much trouble. Now, it could be very available, but not fully available. Like it could be like 90% available or something like that. Um, and that could be made in such a way that that it's more even thing. Like maybe 50% of the people vote for it and 50% of the people vote against it. And that's kind of the troublesome case where you've kind of not you have like half of the people thinking one thing and half of the people thinking the other thing. One good thing about that case is that is because the data is very available, it's actually easier to reconstruct it. There's less data to also, like, really in terms of the computation, it's, as far as I know, faster than if it was only 50% available. Then another thing is that there's less data missing in the network. So when it comes time to, okay, you've done the reconstruction and you want to reseed it, repush it on the network, and now there's only like 10% of the data, or 20% of the data, or whatever it is, but like a lot more than 50% that you need to send on the network. So there's just less things that need to be going around before everyone is on the same page, basically. So that's another thing. And yeah, in terms of, I mean, how much time is there? So in this case of, okay, at 4 seconds, there's a certain, temporary outcome. Now, basically, you have until the next slot at least to fix things, to like make sure that reconstruction can happen, and then the network kind of heals. And I mean, in the meantime, what people will be doing is just they keep listening. So, their temporary view is that, okay, I know a block, but I didn't get some of the columns. But you're still on that subnet. And once someone reconstructs and sends the columns through the subnet and you see them, then you'll immediately basically change your opinion on the block. Like once you see all the columns on the subnets that you're assigned to, or that you've chosen, then you consider it as available. So yeah, during these 8 seconds between the decision deadline and the end of slot, this is what needs to happen, basically. Like that's there is reconstruction and basically enough time for data to recirculate on subnets, and yeah, for people to like change their mind and all agree on something being available. But of course, like, yeah, in practice, we're gonna need to see then how it actually works on devnets and testnets, and see if it actually yeah, if it works out fine, or I mean, of course, like all kinds of like attack scenarios will be tried, and will not just have testnets where the data is fully available, and yeah, just YOLO into mainnet.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. And like, thanks for your concrete answers. Like, I feel like it might have been even possible to like make things more formal, in the sense like that, in the sense that have a model that like is not just simple as um, one out of n, like a supernode or something, but is closer to what we are really trying to model, and then be able to drive concrete guarantees. But I totally agree that it seems like it will work in practice, and we can get more confident with testnets. Um, I want to let others ask questions, so feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So you mentioned this accountability of free riders, right, to ensure that they actually verify the blobs that they're supposed to verify, like I mean the columns that they're supposed to verify. But this accountability, if I understand correctly, only happens if there's already basically a fork. So I have two questions with that. One, how do you even make sure that something is not available? Like there needs to be a deadline, right? And the second, have you thought of other ways? I mean, the fork itself is already, even without any disincentive, the possibility of a fork itself is already a disincentive for anybody that holds any sort of stake in the system to just make sure that there's no fork, if they're rational and not just malicious. So is there, so is there, but still, the probability of that happening is very low, assuming that the rest are following the protocol and you can just like free ride basically. So have you thought about this, or have you thought about other ways to make people accountable even if the protocol continues normally?
Yeah, so I mean, I personally haven't worked on this, but there was actually for years like this construction called proof of custody, which is somewhat related to all these things, but more intricate. And this actually was specifically meant for basically trying to address the lazy validator case, like someone that kind of just signs and just says like, oh, sure, sounds good to me. If other people sign, or because someone else tells them that that is, things are available, or just fine, generally speaking. And this was kind of, yeah, meant to be like um, something that it doesn't rely on this like tail risk, but really it relies on just like simple normal case incentives. It was basically like, okay, once every month or weeks or something, there's gonna be like a little bomb hidden where that's specific to you. Like if you happen to sign something without downloading it, and you don't realize that this bomb is there, this cryptographic bomb, it's gonna explode and you're gonna lose some money. And it happens rarely, but like enough that it's basically it makes sense for you to download things. But yeah, I mean, this is something that I guess at least right now we're not planning to do, or like we're not planning to do in the immediate. I don't know, not sure like what's like the long-term plan for this thing specifically. I mean, for me, I guess this validator custody thing, like this as in accountable validator custody thing, is like um yeah, like a slight, disincentive, extra disincentive towards being lazy, just because I mean it's yeah, it's not just like, oh, just modify your client and not choose things. You're explicitly like violating something that the protocol is telling you to do, and in principle can have a punishment. Of course, it's really a tail risk, but yeah. So that's one aspect. Like I think it's like a minor kind of disincentive there. I don't think about it as like this is like the main thing to do. The main reason why we want to do this. I think about it mostly as like um, just really trying to have a cleaner story of around protection from double spends. Again, as you said, like, yeah, the case of a fork is already like a horrible case, and like I think whether or not there's this extra slashing thing on top, it's very unlikely that it would happen because of trying to double spend a small minority of non-super node full nodes. So I don't think that this is like a particularly realistic attack scenario, but I think it's still nice to have these like kind of a bit cleaner guarantees, and not like have somewhat different guarantees because of introducing sampling. But yeah, I mean, actually, right now we're not really. It's not clear whether or not this is going to be part of the spec. Whereas like the basic validator custody will almost definitely be. So yeah, I think there's kind of open like room for like the debate on this.
Right. Thank you.
More questions for Francisco? I have one more question. So a while ago, when I was more closely following the work on PeerDAS and like data availability sampling in general, I remember one of the problems we were like I would hear about was the problem of network layer poisoning attacks and like a topic being overtaken by a minority of the nodes and so on and so forth. In this design, like from your perspective, what is the realistic risk of like a network layer attack happening and like a splitting view because we have just poisoned subnets?
So I guess two things. One is like I mean, okay, I guess I should preface first of all, I'm not even though I'm talking about this, I'm not actually I'm very much not a networking expert. But so there's that part. But I think one of the reasons that or one of the main reasons that actually PeerDAS originally was chosen as kind of a short term or midterm kind of way to progress from 4844 was specifically that it didn't really use new networking infrastructure, and it really, I mean, it basically just reused like subnets and then like request response protocols between peers. So yeah, just ask your peers things. Now in what I discussed, there's not even this later part, so it's really just reusing subnets. I know I mean, your question was specifically about subnets and like taking over subnets, and I think yes, this is like a a real thing that someone can do. But also the thing is, and I mean, I don't think it's even like just about subnets. I think just generally, like the P2P network is kind of this, in some sense, maybe weak link of security. Like it's of course like it's a bit, it can be a bit easier to take over a subnet because it's smaller, but I don't think it's like an order of magnitude easier to take over a subnet than to take over the whole network. Like, or at least like just generally, I mean, by when I say take over is like, just generally make it harder for the network to work, like to the point of kind of yeah, at least some things breaking. And I mean, the good thing about using just things that we already use in the network is that at the very least we're not adding extra kind of points of failure. Like sure, now by using subnets for this thing, it's if you manage to attack subnets, or I mean if you manage to generally like attack the network like gossip sub, there's another thing that can fail. But yeah, basically I think if you could do this kind of attack on like a column subnet, you could do that kind of attack on like an attestation subnet, or you could probably do that kind of attack on like the beacon block public global topic. And so generally you could already kind of yeah, basically prevent the network from being live, or like really slow it down, or like this kind of thing. So I think that's I mean, it's not like comforting that it's potentially possible to do these things with lower resources than burning 2/3 of the stake or something. But at least we're not like piling on, I think, more the surface area for attacks. And then another thing is that there is this construction called proof of validator, which is quite interesting, which is basically something where you can derive a unique key pair for your for a validator, but that is kind of not provably derived in such a way, but that doesn't link you to the specific validator identity. So there's going to be like every validator has a unique key pair, but unless they reveal it, there's no link between the validator key and this new key pair. And you could use this key pair as your network identity. And so you basically have a validator network that is only kind of accessible, where you can only authenticate yourself through a validator identity, even, again, where it's not linkable to your real validator identity, but like this like unique thing that you derive from it. And yeah, the nice thing about that is you can basically have like a Sybil resistant network actually in that case. And yeah, it's nice because then you can actually make sure that if the validator set is sufficiently actually I mean honest, like trying to make the protocol work, it's a lot harder to disrupt that. Like you can actually have like provable statements about you need this much of the stake to do this and that to the network, at least in terms of attacks that involve like just placing a lot of nodes in a certain places or things like that. I mean, of course, if you can like target actual I don't know, like if you can just like look at someone's IP and DOS them, then that's a different thing. But like at least it's resistant to Sybil attacks and like things that, you know, try to take over certain parts of the network and things like that. And yeah, the nice thing is that then at least consensus would be a bit more insulated from these kind of attacks. Of course, you could still attack the sort of broader network that would live around it in some sense, but that would have like lower consequences, kind of lower stake. Like you could, you know, maybe if there's someone that isn't a validator, is just a full node, you could get them to not be able to confirm transactions for some time, or I mean, you could eclipse them and things like that. But at least it kind of limits the damage to this kind of more individualized attacks rather than like really, you know, taking down the whole network.
I didn't know about the proof of validator construction. Thanks for
There's
sharing.
an ETH research post from
Okay.
some of my colleagues.
I just found it. Thank you.